You're listening to Secure Ventures, the show that follows cutting-edge founders in the cybersecurity space to understand their plights, glories, and revolutionary products. I'm your host, Kyle McNulty. I'm also a full-time investor at In-Q-Tel, a strategic investor for the U.S. intelligence and defense communities. This show is a personal outside activity separate from and not affiliated with In-Q-Tel in any manner. All comments, opinions, and sponsorships are wholly independent. This episode is a recording of a live interview held on stage at Blue Ventures Cyber Venture Forum in February. A huge shout out and thank you to the Blue Ventures team for putting together such an awesome event. In this episode, I spoke with Rick Howard, previously Chief Security Officer at Palo Alto Networks from 2013 to 2019. Rick has a wealth of cybersecurity industry experience, and he wrote a book called Cybersecurity First Principles and maintains the Cybersecurity Book Hall of Fame called the Cybersecurity Canon. In this episode, we discuss his perspective on the fundamental themes of cybersecurity with a lens to how entrepreneurs and investors can leverage these ideas. This episode is brought to you by VulnCheck. VulnCheck helps teams defend against weaponized exploits by delivering the most comprehensive vulnerability and exploit intelligence in the market today. VulnCheck gives enterprise and federal teams better, faster data so they can autonomously prevent exploits and reduce risk and outpace adversaries. So what's different about VulnCheck? The company delivers its solutions to teams in machine-readable and consumable formats for a truly autonomous approach to vulnerability prioritization and exploit mitigation. VulnCheck has close to 300 million unique data points, which is 5 times the exploits of ExploitDB, and 200 plus CVEs packaged into complete detection artifacts for proactive teams. VulnCheck provides a full suite of solutions to enable teams with rapid adoption of VulnCheck data, including its community tier of offerings and its enterprise-class solutions, exploit and vulnerability intelligence, and initial access intelligence. With VulnCheck, teams can proactively defend against remote execution events, enrich every data source, and continuously outpace adversaries. If you're interested in learning more about VulnCheck and checking out the free community edition where you can play with their database of known exploited vulnerabilities, please click the link in the show description so they know you came from the podcast.
All right, welcome back. While you're enjoying your lunch, we have a treat for you. One of the most entertaining speakers and, likes to study his presentation is Rick Howard. I worked with him back at VeriSign, and we just missed, but he was almost my professor at West Point. So, really fascinating speaker, a former Chief Security Officer at Palo Alto Networks. You're gonna hear a lot more from that as Kyle, I'm sure, digs into that, and a little bit about his current project that he's working. So Kyle and Rick, welcome.
Oh man, look at the bright lights.
All right, awesome. Well, Mike already saved me from doing the introduction work on Rick here. Really needs no introduction. Palo Alto Networks, I think everyone in this room has heard of before.
They're a small little up-and-comer startup,
Yeah. And then after Palo Alto Networks, you ended up going to N2K. I know we have a couple folks in the room here today as well. Everyone's probably familiar with the CyberWire Daily podcast if you're in the cyber ecosystem.
Can I tell that story?
Yeah, please.
When I left Palo Alto Networks, I thought I was going to retire, right? But I used to go on the CyberWire podcast, and they have like 20 of them. I used to go on all the time and hawk our wares, so I knew all those guys. So when I left Palo Alto Networks, I called the CEO and said, hey, you should let me do a podcast. I never even thought he would answer me. But he called me the next day and said, you should come work for us. So that's what I got to do. I got to spend the last 5 years working on a cybersecurity podcast.
What was that like going from a company of like 5,000 to...
Yeah, well, that was the other thing. I was the chief security officer of N2K, which is a startup. So we had 40 people.
Right.
We had two IT guys and a dog, and I was the security person. And I wasn't allowed to touch anything because I'd break it. So going from Palo Alto Networks, who had an army of cybersecurity people, to a startup that had nothing, it definitely changed my views about what was important and what wasn't.
And this is actually a nice segue. In this conversation, we're going to talk a bit about the 2 books, or really 1 book and then a kind of collection of books. One of the things you mentioned in your book, Cybersecurity First Principles, was how you had a discussion with Peter, the CEO of N2K, around, hey, can we do this kind of more in-depth cybersecurity review for the company?
Yeah.
And Peter said, well, how much is this going to change our assessment based on like the high level assessment? And you said, well, maybe like 10 percentage points or so. And he said, okay, well, skip it.
Yeah, and I can make a decision on what you've already given me.
Right.
Yeah, so I'm a big believer in trying to calculate cybersecurity risk for a company, which, by the way, the whole industry sucks at. We are horrible at it. The way that most people do this is with heat maps, right? You guys know what heat maps are, right? On an x-axis is all the bad things that could possibly go wrong, and on the y-axis is how bad it's gonna be when it does go wrong. And so what happens is all the really nasty stuff floats high and to the right, and the benign stuff floats low and to the left. And so I would go into, oh, by the way, if you're good at spreadsheets, you can color code it, right? So the high and to the right is red, the middle stuff is yellow, and the benign stuff is green, so that's why they're called heat maps. And I would go into boardrooms and say, and circle the red and say, this is really scary, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Give me $1 gazillion to fix it. And sometimes that would work and sometimes it wouldn't, but it is just a horrible way to present risk to the business, right? In fact, there are reams of research that shows that heat maps are horrible ways to convey risk to leadership. So we need a better way. So I think you should be able to calculate the probability of a material event to your organization due to a cyber event. So like you said, I went to Peter and I did this gross calculation that said, hey, Peter, I think there's like a 20% chance that CyberWire will get hit by a material cyber event. Right? And what I really want to do is spend the next year really diving into the numbers, find all the things, count all the things, and get a better, more precise answer. And he gave me what you said, and it was just big epiphany for me. When you calculate cyber risk probabilities, you don't need precision. You need good enough answers. Ballpark answers so that you can make a decision with, and Peter came up with that. Not a cyber guy, a CEO of a startup.
One of the other things you talked about, and we'll come back to this, is red teaming, right? But in this context, you have an initial idea of what you think your probability is with your initial assessment. How do you even have the confidence to say how much more accuracy you'll have with a more in-depth assessment?
Yeah, you have to make those calculations yourselves. You talk about red teaming, and I'm not a fan of red teaming by itself. Right? Because a red team, you turn a red team loose, even on something very specific on your organization, they're gonna find some way in. That doesn't really help me make my organization better. You turn a red team into a purple team though, a red team that emulates, let's say, Wicked Spider, and a blue team in the Security Operations Center who is looking for Wicked Spider attacking your network, and they go one-on-one with each other, then I think you can improve your processes to keep Wicked Spider out of your network.
Yeah, and we'll come back to that whole line of thinking, but before we get too far out of the risk quantification piece and risk assessment piece, one of the things I really liked about your book was the outside in versus inside out risk assessment. Can you just describe that for the audience really quickly?
Yeah, most people, when I talk to CISOs and other security professionals out there, and I tell them you should calculate the probability of a material event in your organization, they think back to their college days when they took their Probability and Stats 101 course. You all remember this back in those days? What was the thing I remember from that course? Well, we put colored marbles into an urn, and then we had to predict if the blue one was gonna come out or the red one was gonna come out, all right? And I barely got through that course by the skin of my teeth, by the way, right? And that is certainly a way to think about probability, but it's really a small percentage of how to think about it. What I wanna change your minds about is that probability is really a measurement of uncertainty. How certain are you that something bad or something good is gonna happen? And there are people that have figured this out, all right? There's a great book, a Cybersecurity Canon Hall of Fame book called Super Forecasting. How many people have heard super forecasting before? Some of you have, that's great. Written by Dr. Tetlock back in the 2000s, right? And he's this old curmudgeonly kind of guy, right? He hates everything. And he was watching the cable news shows back in the 2000s, you know, MSNBC, Fox, and whatever your favorite one was. And they would always bring these pundits on who predicted something correctly once in their career, but they've been wrong ever since. But they would bring them onto the panels and get their opinion on something that's gonna happen in the future. And you know, Tetlock would raise his fist and say, why would you have that guy on? And I always thought there should be like a chyron at the bottom of the screen that says, this guy's 1 for 37. Maybe don't pay attention to what he's talking about, right? So Tetlock, he's working for IARPA, okay, the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Agency. It's kind of like DARPA, but for the intelligence community. And he devises this experiment, and he has 3 groups. the intelligence community, the academic community, and a group I like to call the geezers on the go, right? The geezers on the go are just these old people that had time to solve puzzles. And he gives them 500 really hard forecasting problems, like, will the president of Syria get assassinated next year? All right, and then he grades the groups over a 5-year period. Who do you think wins?
Geezers.
I know, I may have buried the lead, okay? So the geezers on the go win by 60%. By 60%, they beat the academic community who had access to classified information, and they destroyed the academic teams, right? But there was a subset in the geezers on the go, the super forecasters, who beat everybody else by another 60%, right? So it's possible to make risk calculations on really difficult problems. I'm finally going to answer your question. What is outside in and inside out? The way these super forecasters do it, these people are not PhD scientists. They're not doing Monte Carlo algorithms. They're not trying to build algorithms. They're just being smart about how they assess new evidence coming in. So the first thing they do is an outside-in evaluation. What is the probability that any leader of a country will get assassinated in the next year? And you can actually get those stats from just looking at news, just looking at world history. That's a pretty easy calculation to make. Even CSOs that count marbles coming out of urns can make that calculation, right? So they get an initial assessment of an outside-in, any leader getting assassinated. Then an inside-out assessment is they start looking at evidence that they can gather to see what president of Syria does to protect himself, how they move in spaces, all those kinds of things. And as new evidence comes in, they adjust the initial forecast up or down based on that. And over time, they get a pretty accurate prediction of what could happen.
Yeah, I think it's a super interesting idea to start with the outside in and then move to the inside out, which is what you're suggesting, right?
And you can do that with cyber pretty easily. We know what the probability of any vertical getting hit by a ransomware attack. We can count those. We just count what happens in the news, right? And by the way, what do you think that number is? Do you think it's big or do you think it's small? So raise your hand big, okay? What do you think the probability is? Is it 80%? 60%. Anybody want to get a counter offer out there? 20 is closer. It's like 10%, all right? There's 6 million organizations in the United States alone, all right? That is government institutions, academic organizations, public and private companies. About 5,000 cyber attacks happen every year. So you do the math. It's really small. Depends on what vertical you're in. If you're in the financial community, your probability is way higher because guess what? That's where the money is, right? But if you're chopping down wood in Oregon, your chances of getting hit by a ransomware attack are pretty small, right? So you can calculate that. Even CISOs like me can calculate that outside-in calculation.
Yeah, and I think it's very easy to get caught up as an organization where you have invested in all these cybersecurity controls and say, oh, my organization's different, like, look how good our AppSec program is, or look at our security operations team and the talent that we've hired. Let's start there. Obviously, the general numbers don't apply to us, but in reality,
they totally do. They totally do. And what makes that interesting, though, is I can take the outside-in analysis without even considering my own organization's defensive posture. So let's say we'll give it 20%. Let's say there's a 20% chance that I will be hit by a ransomware attack next year. And then I look at what I've deployed in terms of security. Do I have a firewall? Do I try to do zero trust? Do I try to do resilience? Whatever I've deployed, okay, we should be able to calculate how much risk reduction that makes to my overall posture. And if you can't, as a cybersecurity professional, you're not doing your job.
And we have a lot of investors in the audience here today. And one of the things that came to my mind as I was thinking about this was, okay, well, what's the risk that investors deal with on a daily basis as investing in a company? Mm-hmm. How do you think this applies there?
It applies directly because the investors know how to make those calculations, right? You're making those calculations all the time. What hasn't happened in the industry, in the security industry, is that CISOs are afraid of those calculations, and you investors should hold their feet to the fire. Said, you should be able to tell me what the risk posture is to your organization. If you can't, maybe I shouldn't invest in you, right?
Okay. So let's go back to the red teaming piece a little bit more. You talked about the value of purple teaming in particular. I think purple teaming is a capability that generally is much less mature in the ecosystem as a whole. What was the conversation for you like internally for deciding whether or not to include purple teaming as kind of one of the like core tactics within your book?
Well, let's talk about the spectrum of those kinds of things, right? The first layer is just penetration testing, right? The penetration tester, you just turn them loose on your network and they can do whatever they want to find something. That has absolutely no value to a CISO, right? I guarantee you they're gonna find something. That doesn't help me improve my organization at all. Then the next layer up is red teaming, where the penetration tester takes on the mantle of a known adversary group, like Wicked Spider. So they run the adversary campaign across the intrusion kill chain at each stage, and they see if they can break through your defenses. That has a little more value, right? But the real value is, can the Security Operations Center, as the red team emulating Wicked Spider, can they discover everything they do? And if they can't, that's the learning opportunity that we can do, right? And so here's why it's valuable though. How many adversary campaigns do you think are running on the internet on any given time? What do you think it is? Is it big or small? Now the crowd is leery because I know I called them on it last time. Big, all right? Is it 1,000? Is it hundreds? Nobody knows. It's about 250. That's it. That's it at all, right? If you guys are familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK framework, some of you are. MITRE tracks known adversary campaigns, mostly nation state. They're tracking about 150 active campaigns on any given day. The FBI and Microsoft track another 100 that deal with cybercrime. It's only 250, right? So theoretically, you could track all that in a spreadsheet, right? I would know everything that Wicked Spider does and the rest of the 250 in a spreadsheet and put prevention controls in place into my environment, and I would stop all activity, okay? That sounds really easy when you say it out loud like that. It's really hard, it's really expensive, but that's what we should be trying to do. So I've lost track of the question now, right?
It was around purple teaming and kind of how that fits in.
So if you pick Wicked Spider or any of the other known adversary campaigns, your SOC should be able to pick up when you see activity like that. Those adversary campaigns, they may have anywhere from 30 steps in their attack pattern to 500, depending on how complicated it is, right? And I would love to see investors invest in this kind of a product. I would like to be able to say, you know what? We've seen 2 of the 100 things that Wicked Spider does in your network on your environment. It's probably not Wicked Spider. But if you see 80 of the 100, Wicked Spider's in your network, and you probably should do something like, call the FBI or something, right? So I would love to be able to see that kind of thing in the products that we buy out there.
Yeah. And so thinking about the kind of purple teaming landscape from a tool ecosystem lens, and just playing maybe a fun brainstorming game for a second, if you think back to your time when you were at Palo Alto, like what would that ideal purple teaming solution have looked like? Or do you think it's just kind of fundamentally different tools for the red team and different tools for the blue team, because the blue team will never have access to see what the attackers are actually using in reality?
I think what has to happen for those is not really a tool set, but it's really a gaming methodology. Like when they do crisis management exercises, red team exercises step 1, everybody stop. What'd the blue team do, all right? Blue team said, well, we did this. Oh, we didn't see it. Oh, stop. Let's see what we should have done in the meantime. Then start the exercise again. So someone managing that could be partially automated, but probably some contractor running that whole show for you.
Sure, sure. Well, yeah, there's probably a plug for AI in there somewhere.
Somewhere AI is gonna,
maybe staying on that lens for just a second, thinking about the book published, I think, what, a year and a half ago or so now? Mm-hmm. What do you think AI has kind of changed most fundamentally from the different principles that you put forth? I mean, one of the big ones was automation, which I think AI accelerates but doesn't necessarily change. Is there anything that you look back now and say, like, with the benefit of hindsight, maybe that's not quite as important, or maybe that's way more important now?
It's a good question. So let me back up to the reason I wrote the book It's called Cybersecurity First Principles, a reboot of strategy and tactics. Because in the last 15 years, I've kind of noticed that all the things we've been doing in my entire 30-year career hasn't really stopped the bad guys from being successful. We've taken, professionals like me have taken what people have done in the past and we've added to it, but I don't know if I can say today that we're any more secure than we were when I started back in the 90s, which got me thinking about what's the first principle for cybersecurity? And you know what got me onto this topic? I heard an NPR news article about two British mathematicians, Russell's one, I can't remember his name, Bertrand Russell. Back in the early 1900s, they realized that mathematicians could get two different answers by using the same set of rules, okay, two different answers, right? And they said, that's probably not gonna work out too well as we start to make things more important down the line. So they decided they would rewrite the rules of math from the ground up using a set of first principles. It took them 80 pages to prove that 1 + 1 = 2, right? And in a famous footnote, Russell says, this might prove useful in the future. Come on, that's funny. And you all thought math nerds weren't funny. That's really funny, right? So I heard them talk about this and I said, well, I wonder if they could come up with the absolute mathematical first principles. What is the absolute cybersecurity first principles? And I guarantee you that you ask any of us in this room what you think the absolute first principle is, we're gonna get a completely new set of answers. Everybody's gonna have their own. So I spent the next 10 years trying to figure out what it is, and I know what it is. Can I tell you?
I know what it is.
You read the book, yeah.
Yeah.
Here's what I think it is, and you can tell me if I'm wrong or not, okay? Reduce the probability of material impact due to a cyber event in the next couple of years. And that sounds really simple, like a Twitter line, but there's really 3 pieces to that. First is you gotta reduce the probability, which implies that you can calculate the probability, so which we suck at, which I tell you how to do in the book, right? The second is material events. Not everything in your organization being attacked by hackers is material to the business, so why waste resources on it? And the third thing is you gotta time bound it. Meaning, not are you gonna be materially impacted somewhere in the future, like 100 years, but maybe in the next business cycle, say 1 to 5 years, right? I can make that calculation, and I can make efforts to reduce that probability to my organization, all right? Now I've lost the question again. That's
okay. I mean, you're segueing me into a different question. I'll come back to the previous one. When I first read that, I thought, okay, this makes sense. Like, it covers a lot of the kind of key concepts that you're mentioning, but one thing I felt was fundamentally missing was this idea of security as a revenue driver as opposed to security as a cost center, where oftentimes security can be more than just preventing a material incident, but rather a feature that actually drives new sales for a product.
Yeah.
How did you think about that element of cyber and how it plays in?
Yeah, version 2 of the book, second edition, will have a whole section on how do you sell cybersecurity tools to CSOs like me. And it goes to the outside in, inside out calculation. A salesperson could go up to let's say, a healthcare organization that says, the outside in probability assessment of your vertical is 20%, right? If you use my product, I can show you how it's gonna reduce that down to 10, right? That's the reason, and I should be able to do that with every new purchase, every new process, and every new device that I put on my network. I need to be able to show what that probability is.
One of the fundamental challenges of that kind of calculation and approach is saying, okay, what is the dollar amount impact of an event? And certainly there's a range as well, right?
Certainly a range, yeah.
With things like HIPAA, you have OCR fines that can be much more easily quantified, but the ultimate impact is far, far greater. I'm curious, going back to your time at Palo Alto, how did you actually think about quantifying the risk, not just in terms of likelihood, but did you do calculations to try to determine the dollar amount impact of some of these events?
I think that's the wrong, I don't want to say that.
That's okay, you can say it.
I don't think that's the right.
No one's listening.
Yeah, they're all eating lunch, okay. The dollar impact is, I think that's the wrong question initially, right? We really want to think in terms of reducing the probability. That said, there's lots of data out there that says for this vertical, the average loss in a ransomware attack is X amount of dollars. That's all public information, right? So that information is new evidence for the super forecaster to be able to use some interesting algorithm and says, we think that the material impact to, let's say, Palo Alto Networks has to be some very large number, all right, because they can afford it. For a startup like my last company, right, that was probably $100,000. If we got hit for more than $100,000, that means that was a company killer, right? That's a material cyber event. So we can do that calculation about, am I in that range for that probability? Yes, it's absolutely possible.
Interesting. So you basically classify it into buckets.
Buckets.
Of material, immaterial, and then think about measuring risk that way.
Exactly, right.
Okay. And one other thing I want to touch on before we maybe move over to Cybersecurity Canon and the work that you've been doing there. You talked about compliance very briefly in the book, and I'm not like a lover of compliance, but I'm sure some people who have come from that whole ecosystem have maybe a heartfelt connection with compliance. And I think there's actually an analogy to say compliance is almost like red teaming your policies and approach by saying, okay, we're kind of double checking that you're doing these different things, even if compliance activities themselves are not inherently adding value or like making you more secure. So I just wanted to hear a little bit more about kind of your lens on compliance and its role within a security org.
Yeah, and I definitely think that section in version 2 needs to be beefed up, all right? But I think of compliance as another risk factor to the business, right? Everybody knows that most people like me don't think that compliance makes you more secure, right? It may have some parallel benefit because of the things they make you to do, but it's not going to make your organization more secure. It might not reduce the probability of material impact. But there is the threat that you could get fined if you don't follow the compliance rules for your industry. That's just another input to the risk calculation, right? I worry about ransomware attacks. I have to pay for that. I worry on whether or not I have to pay a compliance fine. Here's the interesting question, though. How many companies get hit by compliance fines? The outside-in analysis is not that many, okay? Unless you're a big Silicon Valley company like Amazon or Google or Facebook, most companies don't get hit with that, okay? So you need to figure that in to your outside-in analysis and work that in from there.
Okay, now going back to one of the previous questions before we moved on, because I forgot I promised we'd come back to this, the AI piece.
Yeah.
You just mentioned a couple things that you would change in version 2. Is there anything that you think AI kind of fundamentally changes? Any of the first principles that it fundamentally changes?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this because ChatGPT hadn't come out when I published the book, so we didn't really have an answer to that, right? But you're right, I would put it into automation as a first principle for cybersecurity professionals, using automation to make your jobs easier. And I'm probably a contrarian here, but I don't think automation is AI is a first principle. It is another automation tool.
Yeah.
And what I think our industry is missing or getting wrong at this very moment, we're looking for a general purpose large language model that can do all the security tasks in one. And I don't think that's what you should be looking for. I need you to make your products simpler to use and more impactful. And you may use large language models or other forms of machine learning to do that as a tool, okay? But that's not going to change the overall strategy of anything. And if you try to bring automation or AI into your own organization to use that engine to make your business better, it's still really hard to do. There's some stats out there that show that 9 out of 10 large language model products are failing right now because it's really hard to do and really expensive. So I don't think it fundamentally changes the idea of the book.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think you could replace the 9 out of 10 large language model companies are failing with just 9 out of 10 companies are failing. Right?
That's a good point.
So maybe not an exception to the rule is another way of framing that. One other thing that I really wanted to touch on is a lot of the book was focused on kind of key like cybersecurity specific elements of how you think about building a program, specific technology, specific principles. But when I was thinking about building a successful cybersecurity team or cybersecurity company, or even investment firm, which is relevant for the folks here, was about hiring, which you have a ton of experience with. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on just what makes a successful hiring program or just advice you would have for people in the room who are thinking about hiring.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. And it's another chapter in the next edition. I can't believe I missed that in this book, right? Because I fundamentally think that the way the cybersecurity profession hires its people is wrong, right? You've heard that there's a skills gap. I'm sure you've heard that stat. There's some gazillions of number of open jobs in cybersecurity, and we can't seem to find the people to do it. What really is the answer is we're looking for the wrong skill sets, right? We're all looking for unicorns. You know what I mean by unicorns? We need somebody with 35 years experience, has 17 certs, and you want to pay them $1.50 an hour, right? Those people don't exist, okay? That's why those are gaps. We don't have unfilled jobs in the industry at all levels. We have the gaps in the middle tier. We have experts on the team. We can get newbies from anywhere. We have trouble finding the middle tier. So my new idea is, I have my favorite movie of all times is Moneyball. How many people watch Moneyball? Right? Brad Pitt as the manager of the Oakland A's. I'm gonna just throw my nerd hat in the ring right now and say, Brad Pitt is our finest actor we have right now, and I'll fight you for all of that, right? So Moneyball is this idea that, you guys know the story of the Oakland A's. Can I tell it? Right?
Tell the abbreviated version.
Abbreviated version is, Oakland A's is a sub-basement team. They have no money. They have to go up against the New York Yankees, who is a really rich team. The New York Yankees can afford to spend $8 million on a single player. That would eat up the entire budget of the Oakland A's. So Billy Beane, the manager, decides he's gonna use probability and stats to find the skills that he needs, right? And he has to come up with what is the first principle of winning Major League Baseball championships. And you know what he comes up with? You know what the first principle is? Getting on base, okay? It's getting on base. That's the thing he decides to double down on. So he decides that he can build the superstars in the aggregate. He can buy a bunch of players who nobody wants to buy for really cheap, say $200,000 a year, who have a really high on-base percentage. And he does it that year in 2003. And the moral of the story is, he wins one more game than he did the previous year with his old system. He beats the New York Yankees, right? And they go to the division championships with this new model. The question then is, how do you apply that to cybersecurity, right? And I would say you should apply Moneyball ideas to the skill sets you need. Don't go after the superstar who's gonna be a general purpose, get everything done kind of way. Go after the newbie who has a couple of skills that you need. I'm gonna double down on the skills. You know what they are? Not that they can program, not that they can hack, not that they have a certificate. I need them to be able to solve problems, whatever the problem is. Okay? Because I don't want to solve the problem. I have this big dripping bag of problems that I don't know how to solve. I need to be able to hand a couple of them to somebody. You go figure it out. And if you can figure out who that person is, you can train them to have the skill sets they need to do something. And let me give you, for instance, I need someone to manage the identity and access management system for people moving jobs. That's one task I need to do, to make sure that the permissions that person has over here doesn't violate what he should have over here. I need a newbie to do that. I can bring in a newbie to solve that problem, train them how to do it, and that solves my problem. And by the way, that newbie is cheap. Okay, so there's gonna be a Moneyball for workforce development in my second edition of the book.
All right. And then what about specific tactics as you think about making those hiring decisions? I think it's become increasingly polarizing in terms of different interview processes that firms take. But again, I think this is incredibly relevant for all the folks that we have in the room here today. Whether you're a startup, an investment firm, a cybersecurity leader, you have to make these hiring decisions where you're ultimately trying to find the folks who have that problem-solving capability.
Yeah.
What has been your approach? What's worked for you in order to actually test that in the interview and hiring process?
That's a really good question. Because it's really hard to find that person looking at the resume and doing an hour-long interview, right? Because you think that person's great, and we all have horror stories where we thought that was going to be the perfect fit, and it was a horrible thing that happened. We had to fire him soon, right? All right. But I also say that most of my peers have one question at the end of the interview process that has nothing to do with the job requirements, okay? Has nothing to do with how they might fit into the team, the culture fit. It is one specific question around how they solve problems, at least one. The one I always use is, what are you running at your house? Because if you're not running a Linux box that you built by yourself, okay, you're not smart enough to be on my team, right? Not that you have to know how to run Linux, but you took a problem you didn't know anything about, you figured it out, and you installed it. That person, I can train to do anything.
Huh, interesting. Okay, well, let's keep talking about Cybersecurity Canon then.
Okay.
And Cybersecurity Canon, maybe I'll let you put it in your words as well, but essentially a collection of cybersecurity books and kind of reference material for folks who are interested in learning more about the space. And the idea is catered to experience levels of all types. How many books are in the canon now?
Well, I mean, we have a couple of categories, but Hall of Fame books that we think everybody should read, there's about 50 right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then broader, you're talking hundreds?
Hundreds, yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe my first question for you is, even from 50 Hall of Fame books, I would love to, in theory, read 50 cybersecurity books.
Even I haven't read all of them. Okay,
Right,
so,
right.
yeah.
How do you think about specifying that list down and prioritizing, given the different appetites that folks in different roles have?
Well, let me tell you what the Canon's trying to do. We're trying to be the first source for curated and timeless wisdom in cybersecurity, right? That means that if you're looking to read a new book on some new cybersecurity topic, you should go to the Canon webpage, which is sponsored by Ohio State University, and see what we said about it, right? The committee reviews the books and puts them into one of three categories. Hall of Fame, meaning all of us should have read it by now. The second one is niche, meaning it's a great book, but maybe not everybody has to read it, but if you're interested in the topic, it's a good book to read. And probably the most important thing we give to the community is do not read. Because there's lots of crap cybersecurity books out there, and if you're gonna read one, maybe not read a bad one this year, right? So it's a really interesting question, is how do you decide? I asked Perplexity.ai, how many cybersecurity books are published every year? Do you know how many they told me? About 500. So how do you take a list of 500 cybersecurity books and triage them down so that we can put our committee members on to review the important ones? That's a really interesting question. We're trying to figure it out, right?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Have you received any kind of like nasty messages from authors who've books?
Most of the authors, and I get to know, because we get to talk to these guys all the time, they get annoyed with me that we haven't reviewed their book yet.
Okay.
So that's about as angry as they get. But I do have a couple of recommendations for all you out there. Would you like to hear them? Can we?
No. Yeah, go for it.
All right. So for newbies, there's a couple of books I always recommend, and I think I mentioned this last year when we were at this conference, but how many people have read Cuckoo's Egg? 1 or 2, 3, okay, 4. Oh my God, okay, stop what you're doing right now. Go download Cuckoo's Egg and read this book, all right? It is fantastic. It is really one of the first cybersecurity books published in the late 80s, and it still holds water, right? The author, Dr. Clifford Stoll, okay, he was an astronomer at Lawrence Livermore Berkeley Labs, all right? The problem though was they were laying off the astronomy department because they didn't get funding. But Cliff, have you ever seen a picture of him? Cliff is, how do I describe him? He is a lefty liberal, right? So there's people on the right, there's people in the middle, there's people on the left, there's people on the extreme left, there's Cliff, okay? That's where he is on the spectrum. You know, he makes his own clothes, he's got long hair, he's got tattoos, he's got earrings, he gardens his own food, he makes his own shoes, okay? He's that guy, right? But he's also really funny and he's got a lot of charisma and everybody likes him. So the IT department says, hey Cliff, come over to our department. We need someone to run our Unix lab. And then in a year when your astronomy job opens up, you can go back to being that guy. But in the meantime, you can help us out. Oh, and by the way, there's a 75-cent accounting error in the student database records. Back then, we charged students for computer time, right? And every month through the entire student body, it was off by 75 cents and nobody could figure out why. So Cliff, come over, run the Unix lab, figure out this little problem, and you'll help us out and you can go back to being an astronomer later. That 75-cent accounting error was the first evidence of the first public cyber espionage campaign run by the Russians using East German hackers to break into US academic institutions so they could break into US government institutions, because back then there wasn't any security, it was just all strings and cans, right? So Cliff, he's a scientist, he treats it like an experiment. He has hypotheses, he collects data, he coordinates with all this stuff, and the really interesting part is, like I said, lefty liberal, but now he's on the phone every week with the FBI and the CIA and the NSA trying to track these East German hacker mercenaries down. Okay, and it reads like a Jason Bourne novel, all right? That's why you would like it. There's a love story in it that my wife really liked, and there's a chocolate chip cookie recipe in the back that I've tried, all right? So those are all the good reasons that you should do it. And I was in grad school when the book came out. I was gonna be an IT guy. That book, like it did for most of my peers, changed our career trajectory. We went from being IT guys to being security guys, but purely based on that book. So highly recommend. Have you read it?
I haven't.
Okay.
All right, we'll add it on there. Okay, and then what about for investors and builders? People who are starting these companies or involved in the ecosystem in a slightly different way than a traditional cybersecurity practitioner, where maybe you don't need to understand like the ins and outs of like the Phoenix Project, for example.
Yeah, I think the Phoenix Project is probably the first book that comes close to what I need, right? How many people read the Phoenix Project? Okay. All right, so I'll just give a little bit about it. The Phoenix Project is a novel about DevOps because the authors knew that nobody was going to read a nonfiction book about DevOps because it wouldn't be that interesting, right? So he tells a story about a real company that's going through a real problem, and they solve the problem by understanding and deploying DevOps concepts, right? Which is probably the closest book I have in the canon. It's a Canon Hall of Fame book, by the way. All right, that deals with business and running a business. But we are a little bit short on investor knowledge in the canon. So here's my request to all of you. If you know of a book that you highly recommend for cybersecurity investors, please come talk to me so we can get it reviewed, and maybe come talk to me about being on the committee so you can help us figure out what those books are.
All right, there you go. And then maybe talk a little bit more about why this project is so important to you. You stepped down from N2K late last year, right?
Yep.
And you're doing this, well, kind of full time, but then you have a bunch of other just kind of like random side projects, advisory roles, et cetera.
Yeah, I'm retired, okay, but that doesn't really work out that well. Well, I started the Canon project about 10 years ago when I was the CSO of Palo Alto Networks, because I was going around talking to the country, all these InfoSec professionals, mostly CISOs, who stopped reading. Okay, they would read blogs and they'd listen to podcasts, but they weren't doing any in-depth reading. So I collected a bunch of my friends, and we set it up like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for cybersecurity. My friends would read the books, and they would write a book review and put the book into those three categories that I just told you. So we've been doing it now for 10 years. But how many people heard the Canon Project before you came here today? Some of you have. Look, not very many, all right? Because our marketing sucks at this, right? So, but we didn't have any way to bring any money in to throw money at marketing, so we decided last year to make it a nonprofit. It's completely volunteer, nobody's making any money on it, but we do have some operational costs. So we're out trying to raise money to be able to pay the bills so we can keep this worthwhile project going. So all you big bucks investors out there, please come talk to me. I could use your checkbooks.
All right. Well, last thing, I just want to kind of give you a chance for an open comment. Thinking about the group that we have in the room here today, a lot of security leaders, people starting security companies, people investing in security companies. Is there anything just in general that you would impart as wisdom upon this audience?
Yeah, you know, I've been a serial CISO. I've been a CISO 3 different times in various kinds of organizations. Here's what I don't need from the security vendor community. I don't need a new tool. I don't need a new tool. I need you to make the tools that I have work more efficiently together. Right? Every tool that I have means I have to put somebody on it to make it run correctly, right? And there's been hardly any effort to make those tools seamlessly work together. So if I could ask you to look at areas of investment, please streamline those operations so whatever tools I have connects to whatever those tools they are, and they efficiently talk to each other and tell me things that I need to know about improving my InfoSec program.
Spoken like a true Palo Alto veteran.
Yeah, we did sell a packaged view of that, right? So I agree, but that's what we need.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much for the time, Rick.
Thank you, man. That was good. Thank you, I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Big round of applause for Rick here.
So I was sitting next to someone down there, Rick. I got one question for you. And so I know you're a man of many facets. I know about your incredible love of comics and comic books. But I've also heard that you're writing a horror book right now.
I am.
Can you tease us with a little bit of your horror book and what's going on there?
Okay, so yes, I read a lot of books in the year, but half of the books I read is just trash, like vampires and zombies and all that stuff. And when I was growing up in high school, I was the city's collector of ghost stories. So as a father-daughter project, we are writing a horror novel together, right? So I'll let you know how that turns out in the future.
All right, one big round of applause for Kyle and Rick here.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can write to me at kyle@secureventures.io. I'm Kyle McNulty, and you've been listening to Secure Ventures.